Around 1900, a wave of mill closures swept across the region. The Mühlensterben, the dying of the mills. The tower windmill at Waldfeucht in the Selfkant is one of the very few that survived it. Built in 1897 on the flat, open field south of the village, it replaced an older post mill that had stood on the same earthwork rampart until a storm knocked it down. From this spot, a person could once look east across the low horizon toward the Heinsberg region and west deep into Holland and count more than 20 windmills standing along that line. All but this one have long since stopped working. Most have vanished completely. The miller doesn't live at the mill itself. His house is in the village, and every morning he walks out to work with his son, who has learned the milling trade the same way he did. The working day starts with grease, not grain. Before anything else, the wooden gearing that transmits the wind's power to the grinding mechanism has to be oiled. Every joint, every point of contact checked and serviced before the mill can turn a single revolution. The oil can waits on the Mellzelle, the lowest floor of the mill. From there, the miller climbs up to the Steinzelle, the second floor, where the millstones themselves sit to collect a set of wax candles he'll need for light and for checking the machinery in the darker corners of the tower above. The stairs continue further still, past the Lüzelle, up to the Kappenzelle, the topmost floor directly beneath the cap itself and the last stop on this daily circuit before the real work of the day can begin. It's here that the mill's main gearing lives, the large Steenrad reaching down from above to mesh with the horizontal Konrad beneath it, the two wheels engaging at a right angle to turn vertical rotation into horizontal drive. The wooden teeth, the cogs, where these two great wheels touch, have to be smoothed by hand every single day, without exception, so that they run against each other with as little friction as possible, day after day, year after year. To reach every tooth, the miller turns the blades slowly from outside, drawing them around bit by bit, so that the full hardwood rim of each gear passes under his hand and gets its coat of grease in turn. A slow, deliberate rotation done purely for maintenance, long before the mill is anywhere near ready to actually grind anything. While the gearing is still being serviced, the cap and the blade cross are already being turned into the wind using the tail pole, the stairs, with the wind this particular morning coming out of the southwest. The cap itself sits on rollers running along the top of the tower's stone wall. At the far end of the tail pole, which hangs down almost to the ground, sits a small winding stool with a winch, and from that winch, a length of chain unwinds. An iron ring locks that chain onto one of 12 winding posts set into the earth at even intervals in a circle around the tower. As the chain winds back in, it draws the tail pole toward the post, and by choosing which of the 12 posts to hook onto, the miller can turn the cap and its whole blade cross to face any direction the wind happens to be coming from. Once the blades stand square to the wind, pegs are dropped down along the tail pole to lock the winding gear firmly in place, so the cap can't drift out of position through the rest of the morning. With the gear teeth freshly greased, the miller now climbs up into the cap housing itself, where the massive main drive shaft runs straight through, its own bearings needing exactly the same daily attention as everything else in the mechanism. The rear journal of the shaft gets a coat of ordinary oil. The front neck of the shaft, by contrast, is coated with a stiffer grease, suited to the much heavier load it carries at that end. With the running gear now fully serviced and ready, the actual sail rigging of the blades can begin. The rolled sail cloths are laid out ready in front of the mill's main body. Soaked through with linseed oil, they're protected against rain, frost, and the heat of direct sun, a treatment that has to be reapplied periodically to keep the fabric from rotting in weather that would otherwise ruin it within a season or two. Each blade gets its sail fitted one at a time, braced from behind with a long sail hook while the miller works. The blade rods themselves, painted red and white, were originally made from resin-rich softwood. On this mill, they've since been replaced with a sturdier metal construction. Small hooks, called kickfrösche, sit along the rod, meant purely for fastening the sail's edge. Just beside the rod runs the streamlined sheet metal-clad front edge of the blade, while the rear section is built from cross slats tied together top to bottom by 3 long running laths, A lattice, the lappengita, that forms the whole surface the sailcloth will stretch across. To fasten a sail properly, it first has to be carried up and unrolled to its full length, so it covers the rear lattice completely from base to tip. The miller climbs the lattice itself the way you'd climb a ladder, rung by rung, hooking the front hem of the cloth into the sail hooks along the rod as he goes, while the outer hem is tied off separately from below by whoever's working the ground beneath him. This particular sail, it turns out, is damaged near the bottom edge and will need patching before too long, a repair the miller notes in passing but doesn't stop to fix in the middle of the morning's work. To bring each blade around to a working position in front of the mill's main body, one at a time, the brake chain, known as the pram, hanging down the outside of the tower, first has to be loosened, then pulled tight again once the blade is in place. From above, the pram engages directly with the mill's gearing, and it's strong enough to stop the entire running mechanism outright if needed, holding a blade rock steady while the miller works on it rather than letting the whole cross drift under its own weight. Down below, a second sail hook, mounted low near the base, keeps the long blade rod from swaying as the miller climbs. The rod leans slightly forward by design, and without that extra brace, the climb would be considerably less stable, especially with a rolled sailcloth balanced under one arm. It's slow, deliberate work, done one rung and one handhold at a time, with the miller and whoever's helping him on the ground calling instructions back and forth to coordinate exactly when to slacken the brake, when to pull it tight, and when it's safe to start climbing the next blade in turn. Near the top, the sail's heart-shaped upper end gets tied off outside at the base of the blade to a ring that slides freely back and forth along a rail. A fitting that lets the whole cloth be pulled away from the blade entirely, or spread back out for operation without anyone having to untie anything else on the sail. On the inside, the sail is tied close against the rod to one of the cross laths, and every knot at this stage is chosen with real care, specifically so it won't work itself loose as the blades spin through their full circle, over and over, hour after hour, all day long, in whatever wind the mill happens to be carrying. Along the inner hem of the sail runs a continuous rope, forming evenly spaced loops for the sail hooks. Along the outer edge, 3 separate lines of different lengths attach at the upper third, the middle, and the lower third of the blade. These two serve as tie points, pulled down to the back of the blade surface and knotted around the slats there. But these particular knots have to do the opposite job of the others. Instead of holding fast no matter what, they're tied so that they'll release on their own if a sudden gust threatens to tear the whole cloth away. Those 3 outer lines are what let the sail be reefed, shortened in stages, 3 of them, matched to however strong the wind happens to be running. At a blade length of 10 meters and a total width of 2¼ meters, a single fully rigged blade presents 22½ square meters of sail. Across all 4 blades, that comes to 90 square meters catching the wind at once, a substantial surface, and part of why so much care goes into how it's tied down. Partway through the rigging, the wind shifts direction on him, and the cap has to be rewound all over again to follow it. Something that, on a day with unsettled, shifting wind like this one, might well happen several times before the morning is even out. Each rewinding meaning another trip down to the tail pole and another round of hauling on the chain. The blades only develop their full driving power when the moving air strikes them dead on from the front. Anything less than that, and the mill loses efficiency it can't easily make up elsewhere, no matter how carefully everything else has been serviced and greased. There's real risk built into the raising itself, too. If the wind happens to catch a half-raised sail from the side rather than square from the front, the loose cloth can suddenly billow outward with real force and pull the miller's assistant right off the blade along with it. Sailcloths are typically bought in matched pairs, so that at any given time the mill is running with 2 newer cloths and 2 considerably older ones together, cycling through a kind of rolling replacement rather than being swapped out all 4 at once. A set lasts roughly 5 years before it's worn through completely. The 2 oldest sails on this mill are already showing serious damage, worn thin, patched more than once, and one of them can no longer even be tied properly into the sliding ring at the top of the blade. In good wind, though, the mill can still run perfectly well on just 2 rigged blades and 2 bare ones, which becomes necessary whenever the miller needs to take an old sail down for patching midday. Because of the jerky, uneven motion that results from running unbalanced this way, millers here call it grinding with the barrier bar. Even with only 3 of the 4 blades sailed, the cross has already begun turning on its own in the wind. It needs only a light push from the miller to get moving properly, the imbalance of one bare blade barely noticeable once momentum builds. Every sailcloth is sewn, along all 4 of its edges, into a strong surrounding rope called the luke, which gives the whole sail a firm, tear-resistant border rather than leaving raw fabric exposed at any edge. The loop rope along the front hem for the sail hooks, the 2 lower tie ropes, and the 3 outer reefing lines are all woven directly into that same luke, one single integrated system rather than separate pieces simply tied on independently and left to work loose over time. Sewing a sail into its luke and weaving all of these lines and ropes correctly into it counts among the most basic, taken-for-granted skills a windmiller has to master before he's trusted with a sail at all. Once all 4 sails are finally rigged, the brake is released for good, and the actual grinding work of the day can begin in earnest, hours after the first oil can was opened that morning. A single, complete turn of the blade cross carries its own name in the trade, a Waldfeucht. The most efficient rotation speed for the whole cross sits somewhere between 18 and 20 turns per minute, and with the light, uncooperative wind blowing this particular morning, reaching even that modest speed requires every last bit of sail area the mill is capable of carrying. The Waldfeucht mill belongs to a specific type known as the Erdhollander, one of the smaller kinds of tower windmill. Unlike a gallery mill, it has no walkway running around the outside of the tower, and unlike a Berghollander, it doesn't sit on an artificially raised mound either. At the very top, where the conical brick tower ends, the cap sits without any fixed connection to the masonry beneath it at all, held in place purely by its own weight, balanced front to back between the blade cross out in front and the tail pole hanging down behind it. We've already seen how the tail pole lets the cap turn to face the wind, made easier by rollers between the underside of the cap and the top of the tower wall, carrying the cap's weight like a carousel, smoothly on a fixed track. The power the turning blades pull from the wind travels through the main shaft into the cap, where the crossed blade rods are wedged into the shaft's outer head. Inside, the large stern rad sits fixed to that same shaft, so whenever the mill runs, shaft, gear, and blades all turn together as one unit. We've already seen how the tail pole lets the cap turn to face the wind, made easier by rollers between the underside of the cap and the top of the tower wall, carrying the cap's weight like a carousel, smoothly on a fixed track. The power the turning blades pull from the wind travels through the main shaft into the cap, where the crossed blade rods are wedged into the shaft's outer head. Inside, the large stern rad sits fixed to that same shaft, so whenever the mill runs, shaft, gear, and blades all turn together as one unit. Stopping the mill entirely relies on a rim brake, a multi-part wooden ring made of poplar, the so-called promvakken, visible here only in cross-section, wraps around the rim of the sternrad, and the prom chain, hanging down the outside of the tower to the ground, pulls that ring tight through a series of lever amplifications whenever the miller needs to stop the gear. The topmost floor inside the tower is the Kappensohle, and running straight down through its center is a vertical shaft, the König, the king shaft, carrying rotational force downward to every other floor. Every other gear in the mill connects one way or another back to this single shaft. First among them, right here at the top, sits the kronrad, which, together with the sternrad, forms the right-angle drive that converts the shaft's vertical rotation into horizontal motion further down. One floor below, on the Leusoller, sits the sack hoist, the Leuwerk. Because the king shaft never stops turning while the mill is grinding, this floor needs its own disengageable clutch, a disc wheel fixed to the king shaft, paired with a separate hoist wheel suspended just above it that can be raised or lowered by hand. Lowered into contact, it picks up the rotation and rope begins winding onto the hoist shaft, ready to pull a full grain sack up from below. A smaller wheel, the clavier rod, the piano wheel, lets the miller either start the hoist running or work it entirely by hand when the wind alone isn't convenient to use. The whole arrangement, from the cap and solar down, is operated by rope pulls running through the Steinsolar all the way to the ground floor, meaning a mill built to catch its power high in the cap ends up controlled, floor by floor, from near the bottom instead. The Steinsolar takes its name from the millstones housed there in two separate grinding runs, one for fine flour, the other for coarser crushing. Here, the king shaft finally ends its journey downward, resting on an iron pan bearing. From the king wheel, rotation passes to a set of pinions, fitted not with conventional teeth, but with round wooden pegs called Triebstücke. By this point, through a sequence of gear ratios, the rotation captured out at the blades has already increased sixfold, reaching, at the grinding runs, somewhere between 110 and 120 revolutions per minute. That final speed, rising and falling with the wind outside, passes by iron spindles straight into the millstones. Only the upper stone actually turns, the runner. From above, a fitting engages by its claw into the mill iron, a bridge-shaped piece fixed across the underside of the stone's central swallow hole. Through the center of the lower stationary stone, the bed stone, the lower spindle rises up to meet that same mill iron. This spindle carries the runner stone, suspending it just a few millimeters above the bed stone, floating rather than resting on it directly. In that narrow gap between the two stones, widened or narrowed depending on how fine the flour needs to be, the grain gets crushed. On the ceiling of the floor below, a connected lever system called the lichte lets that spacing be adjusted precisely. To keep flour dust from spraying everywhere as the stones turn, the whole grinding run is enclosed in a wooden casing called the coop. Sitting on top of it is the Mahlstuhl, holding the hopper into which grain sacks are emptied. As grinding proceeds, kernels slide down over a shaking shoe, the Rüttelschuh, that swings back and forth, feeding them steadily through the swallow hole into the narrow gap between the stones. Centrifugal force from the spinning stone, combined with the suction of moving air, then throws the freshly crushed grain outward against the inside wall of the coop, and from there into the opening of the flour pipe. The flour pipes from both grinding runs hang down into the Messölle, the lowest floor in this type of mill, where, at roughly chest height, box-shaped outlets fitted with sliding gates sit ready above simple sack stands. Sacks are hung directly under these outlets to catch the finished flour as it comes down. And it's from right here, at the bottom of the mill, using the same rope pulls that thread all the way back up through every floor above, that the whole mechanism, gears, brake, hoist, everything, can actually be controlled. In a windmill, the driving power is captured high up in the cap, but its operation is always spread downward, floor by floor, to wherever the miller actually stands. On a clear September day with wind blowing steadily out of the south, the breeze usually freshens noticeably by midday, strengthening to the point that the sails have to be shortened, reefed back in before they carry too much load. A windmiller has to keep a constant eye on the weather because of this. From long experience, he reads the coming change in dozens of small signs: the shape of the clouds, the way smoke drifts, the flight patterns of birds, and, in earlier generations, even by watching how the neighboring mills nearby had set their own sails and blades. There's real danger if the brake is applied too suddenly. A blade can break clean off. And if the friction between the brake blocks and the sternrad's rim ever runs too hot, the mill itself can catch fire. With the wind at this new strength, grinding can continue on the smallest possible sail area. The cloths pulled back to what's known as the storm flaps, right at the base of the topmost reef line, or, as the millers themselves put it, down to the first notch. Bringing the blades in for this, one at a time in front of the mill body, follows the same routine established earlier in the morning. Brake chain loosened, blade drawn forward, chain pulled tight again to hold it steady while the miller works. After the two lower reef ropes are untied at the back and folded forward, they're twisted tightly together with the sailcloth itself, already released from its lower hooks, and the roll that results frees the blade surface all the way up to the height of the topmost reef line. That rolled bundle then gets wrapped around the front edge of the blade, wound several times through the lattice behind it, and pulled tight, secured so it can't possibly work loose while the blades keep turning at speed, gust after gust pressing against whatever cloth remains exposed. For a stretch here, the same sequence simply repeats, blade after blade, in near quiet. No fresh explanation needed, just the same careful reefing routine worked through a second and third and fourth time, the miller moving methodically around the mill body as the wind holds steady at this new, stronger pitch. The tower itself the only real sound, the rhythm of rope and canvas and wood settling into something almost meditative after the busier work of the morning. By the same method, the sails can be reefed down further still, to half their area, or even down to a small corner along the lower third of the blade, which lets the mill keep running at close to the same steady rotation speed, whether the wind outside is weak or gusting hard, rather than lurching between extremes every time the weather shifts. Newer designs exist that avoid this manual work almost entirely. So-called Jalousierflügel, louver blades, where the amount of wind-catching surface adjusts itself automatically, without a miller ever having to climb out onto the lattice at all. In place of cloth sails, these are fitted with narrow, crosswise sheet metal panels that open and close on their own, driven by the same centrifugal force generated as the blades spin. Faster spin pulls the panels open, spilling excess wind, while a slower spin lets them close back down to catch more. It's a genuinely clever piece of self-regulating engineering, and plenty of Dutch and German windmills adopted it over the course of the 20th century. This mill, though, still runs the old way, cloth sails, tied and untied entirely by hand, exactly as they always have been here. With the blades reefed down and back up to their working speed, grinding resumes in full swing once again, the whole tower settling back into its steady working rhythm after the brief interruption. A fresh sack of grain gets hung onto the sack hoist down below, and a pull on the rope engages the hoist's clutch, connecting it to the ever-turning king shaft above. Wind power alone now does the heavy lifting, carrying the full sack steadily upward toward the grinding floor. No muscle needed beyond simply guiding it into place along the way and keeping it from swinging against the walls of the shaft. Once it arrives at the top, the miller ties off a hand rope to hold it securely in position, disengages the hoist so the rope stops feeding, and finally tips the sack to empty its contents into the waiting grinding funnel below, ready for the stones to take over. Below, an empty sack has to be hung in place immediately to catch the newly ground flour, held open by a small hook connected, by way of a line, to a counterweight that keeps tension on it. The stand beneath the multi-level sack bench can be adjusted to fit whatever size sack is being used. Hoisting a sack up, pouring it into the hopper, and bagging the ground flour below repeats in an unbroken cycle over and over throughout the day, which means the miller spends his whole working life climbing stairs, up and down, back and forth between the Melzille and the Steinzille. Above, kernels run ceaselessly from the hopper across the shaking shoe into the gap between the stones. Below, at the end of the flour pipe, finished ground meal keeps emerging in a steady stream. Throughout all of this, the mill has to be held hard into the wind at every single moment it's running. And since the wind has now swung back toward its earlier direction, the cap and blades need repositioning once again, a rewinding that, with practice, can even be carried out while the gear train keeps turning underneath. Wind strength and stone rotation speed both affect how fine the finished flour comes out, which has to be checked repeatedly at the flour outlet, right above the waiting sack, adjusting as conditions shift through the day. Grinding capacity here is relatively high for a mill this size, under good conditions close to a full ton per hour, meaning a fresh sack has to be filled roughly every 3 to 4 minutes without a break. Then, without warning, one of the old sails tears loose from its fastening near the top. The miller catches it almost immediately, by the sudden sound of loose cloth flapping in the wind and by the irregular jerking motion it sends through the blades, and brings the whole mechanism to a stop right away rather than risk further damage. Since grinding can't sit idle for very long without cutting into the day's output, the damage gets only a temporary, makeshift fix for now. As it turns out, the surrounding sail rope will need to be completely resewn, A proper repair job the miller deliberately sets aside for the next windless day when the mill can't be running anyway. For the moment, he simply reties the loose sail with whatever's left of the old rope. By late afternoon, the wind has finally eased off, and the sails can be spread back out to their full working size, down to the very lowest notch, the last corner in the lower reefing section, so that the blades carry nearly their whole sail area once again after a day spent partly reefed against the stronger midday gusts that pushed through earlier. Bringing each blade forward for this follows the same brake routine as always. When the outer brake chain is pulled, running over the drum-shaped prehrad inside the cap, the heavy pramwalken lifts clear, freeing the rim of the sternrad so the blade can be pushed into position by hand. Braking for the next blade lowers that same pramwalken back down, clamping the brake shoes firmly around the main drive wheel until every last bit of motion freezes solid, the whole cross locked in place while the miller repositions himself for the next blade in the sequence. During ordinary grinding, though, the pramwalken stays hooked in its raised position throughout, leaving the whole gear train completely free to turn without any interference from the brake at all, ready to be engaged again the instant it's needed. In spreading the sails back out, each cloth is first fully unrolled, its fastening loops hooked onto the rod one after another, and then reefed back in just to the first notch, this time leaving both of the upper reef ropes tied down rather than fully extending the sail all the way out. It's best when all four blades carry exactly the same amount of sail. That balance is what keeps the whole gear train and grinding mechanism running smoothly and evenly, rather than lurching and jolting with every uneven rotation of the cross, a strain that over time can loosen joints and wear gear teeth unevenly. Walking between the turning blades demands real, constant caution at every single step, no matter how many years someone has spent doing it. The old written accounts of this trade return again and again to accidents where people, and animals too, were struck down without warning by the blades in motion, a hazard every windmiller learns to respect early and never forgets. This is the mill cart, the vehicle used to bring customers' grain in from the surrounding villages. Two bells, fastened to the cart horse's collar, ring out as it approaches, and that sound is the village's signal that the miller has arrived to collect grain and deliver back whatever's already been ground. By old legal custom, those bells were only ever allowed on the mill cart, on no other vehicle. The mill horse, a figure who turns up in local folklore alongside the mill donkey, grows so used to the turning blades overhead that it can be led right up close without shying away. Instead of the plain wooden box more common on other farm carts, this particular one carries a sack-like bag slung underneath it, used to hold whatever small items the miller picks up for his grinding customers on his rounds through the surrounding villages. Errands folded quietly into the regular delivery run, a service that costs nothing extra but keeps goodwill running both directions. The cloth canopy overhead, known as the huff, keeps the grain sacks dry through whatever rain the day happens to bring. Every customer's sacks are clearly marked beforehand, so that no mix-up is possible once dozens of sacks from different farms all end up sitting together at the mill at once. Each person gets back, after grinding, exactly their own grain, never someone else's, and never a mismatched portion. Loaded now with flour from the previous round, the mill cart sets off again to deliver the finished sacks back out to the farms they originally came from. Not every customer waits patiently for the cart to come around, though. Some from the nearby village bring their own grain directly to the mill instead, and, breaking with the old rule of first come, first served, they're served right away rather than made to wait behind whoever arrived earlier that day. Every sack that comes in this way still gets weighed carefully at the entrance first, and that weight is written into the mill's grinding book before the grain is ever poured into the hopper up on the Steinzoller. An empty sack goes straight onto the flour pipe to catch the ground result as it comes down, which is how the mill guarantees that each customer walks away not just with their own grain, properly ground, but with their own actual sacks as well. No mix-ups, no disputes over whose flour is whose. Once a sack finishes grinding, it's weighed again, unhooked, and the second weight gets checked off against the first in the same book. A simple but essential control against short measure. Then the miller takes his own payment using the multerkäppchen, a small scoop reserved for exactly this purpose, still, even now, often paid directly in ground goods rather than cash. That payment amounts, as it always has, to 1/16 of whatever grain was delivered. Ground grain fills a sack noticeably more than the same amount unground did going in, which means checking quantity by eye alone is essentially impossible. Back when grain was measured by volume instead of weighed on a scale, that simple fact caused no end of disputes between milling customers and their millers. Home baking in the household oven fell out of practice long ago here, so bread flour and rye crush, once standard for the black bread common along the lower Rhine, are only rarely ground anymore. Today, the mill mostly produces flour and crushed grain for animal feed, and even for that, fineness still matters a great deal. The miller checks it the old way, rubbing a pinch between his fingers straight over the open sack. That fineness depends on two things working together: the rotation speed, which the miller controls through how much sail he's carrying, and the exact gap between the two millstones inside the grinding run. That gap can be set with millimeter precision using the lichte, the lever mechanism beneath the run, adjusted by rope pull from a distance. Run the stones too close together and the ground material backs up and can spoil from excess heat. Leave the gap too wide and the kernels only get broken coarsely, a real disadvantage, especially for grain meant to fatten pigs. Even the rate of grain flowing into the stones can be tuned simply by changing the tilt angle of the shaking shoe feeding it. Down on the Melziller, this adjustment happens by turning a small notched wheel connected by cord all the way up to the inflow mechanism itself, necessary because a brisk wind and a fast spinning runner stone pull in noticeably more grain than a light one ever could. So the windmiller's working day runs in close, constant conversation with the forces of nature outside, never fully independent of them, however much mechanical skill goes into managing what the wind provides. On the back of the mill's cap, an old inscription reads, "Doch Korn und Kehr gibt Gott der Herr." Yet grain and turn, it is God the Lord who gives. A simple line, but it captures the basic outlook the windmiller shares with every farmer around him, even though he has to master genuinely complicated machinery to make that outlook pay off. At the front of the cap, a second, weathered inscription speaks to plain pride of trade instead. Ich kehrte nur und schaff euch Bröt. I just turn and I provide you bread. Windmill technology like this, shaped by the accumulated experience of many generations reaching back to the Middle Ages, still does honest, useful work here to this day. As the sun sinks low, the working day at the windmill comes to its close. For the night ahead, the sails have to be reefed in completely. Nothing left exposed to catch a sudden gust while no one's watching. Extra security against thunderstorm squalls and real storms comes from the brake itself, backed up by heavy wooden blocks wedged directly between the gear teeth up in the cap, locking the whole mechanism solidly in place. The sliding rails at the base of each blade let the sail rigging be pulled back entirely so that not one scrap of cloth is left anywhere on the blades. Nothing at all left for the wind to grip and work against overnight. As always, once the sails come down, the bare blades are set deliberately into a cross shape in front of the mill's body, a St. Andrew's cross, which in the old blade language once served as a signal, a way of sending simple messages out to the milling customers scattered across the surrounding villages. Now the grinding mechanism falls silent and rests until the windmiller climbs back up to begin his working day again the following morning.